Hi there, it's Llarold. Today I'm going to be talking about patch 10.1, and specifically the new raid being introduced in that patch, Aberrus, the Shadowed Crucible. Earlier this week, Blizzard shocked everyone in the raiding community by announcing that they were going to start testing this raid this week. It's a lot sooner than everyone anticipated, but, not unwelcome. They even were kind enough to lay out their roadmap for how they plan to time out all the testing for this raid tier, and it's basically going to be every Thursday and Friday, every single week through the rest of the month of March, and pretty much to the end of April. Now, we don't know exactly when this patch, or then, obviously the raid tier are going to be landing, but based on that, it's a reasonable assumption that it'll probably be toward the end of June. So with that being said, we got to test the first two bosses on Heroic. We'll get to test each of the bosses on Heroic except for the final boss, and we'll get to test them all again on Mythic as well, probably just once each. We'll see if a test goes really poorly, they will sometimes retest, but sometimes they won't. Testing today went really smoothly. It was the first two bosses on Heroic, so neither of them were super challenging or super complicated, but they were both pretty fun encounters. I really liked them both quite a bit, and I actually found the second one, presumably the second boss in the raid, to be surprisingly complex for where it is in the raid. We also got the opportunity, between doing the testing on both bosses and then after we finished the second, to just poke around and take a look at some of the interior areas in this raid and just see what all the architecture and artwork looked like, and it's pretty cool. I really like the themes that they're going for with this raid. It's basically a mix of fire and shadow. It's kind of going off of, for some of the older players like myself who remember Blackwing Depths, a lot of the dragon experimentation, like an evil dragon laboratory. It's definitely got that feel. It also has fire, which is a pretty important part of dragons. And then it's got all the shadow magic that you would remember from Blackwing Lair and Blackwing Descent and, those kinds of old raids and dungeons from way back in World of Warcraft's history. So paying homage to some old art styles and concepts while also making something that's new and looks pretty cool. I'm very on board with this raid. I'm also on board with this raid from a mechanical perspective. I think the first two fights are pretty interesting. The first fight in particular is simple, and I'll go over it a little bit here. But it's still a pretty interesting fight for a first fight of a raid. We've seen in the last couple of tiers first fights be thinking about Sepulchre, the first ones, that fight is like do this trash pull and then get raid boss loot at the end. Pretty bad. Terra Grew, a fun meme, but kind of a joke. This is like an actual interesting fight. So just to go into this first fight a very little bit, her name is Kazzara the Hellforged. She's sort of like a mini Deathwing, like a patched together shadow fire dragon. She has plates on her that when you break her health, or that break off when you lower her health below 70, 50, and 30%. She'll do like a nova of damage to the raid, and she passively does raid damage anyway, and it ramps up as you lower her health. In terms of the tank mechanic, it's the most basic thing in the world. She hits the tank, it makes him take more damage from the next one, so you just swap it back and forth. Very basic there. She has a Razageth die beam where she'll turn and blast in a direction, so everybody just has to dodge out of that. She has a pushback that's relatively minor. She does every 20 or 30 seconds or so, and it does just, again, more raid damage. She also has some swirlies on the ground you gotta dodge out of. All of those are, if you've raided for a while, they'll all kind of be old hat. They're things you have to dodge and watch out for, but there's nothing new under the sun with any of those mechanics. What's new and kind of interesting with this fight, and surprising that they threw onto a first fight of a raid tier, is the way that she summons rifts and rays. The rifts are a mechanic where she puts a dot onto a number of players throughout the fight. It will stack to more people as the fight progresses. It'll start with like 4 people and then 5 and 6. And after 5 seconds or so, each of those people will explode, doing like fall off damage, so they want to spread out and spawn a rift. Now the rift just puts fire damage on the ground. On heroic difficulty and mythic difficulty, the rift will then spawn rays, which are little fire circles that chase after other players and poop out fire on the ground. What you want to do with those is run them into another rift so that they will despawn. That's not the totally new mechanic. I mean, I remember that from Algalon as far back as Wrath of the Lich King, but certainly for a first boss in a raid, I think that's a pretty cool and interesting mechanic to throw out, along with all of the other ones, of course. So that made for the pretty interesting first raid boss here for most of the people in the raid. I mean, speaking personally as a tank, I basically just dodged and then, used a tank cooldown whenever I was going to get bitten, and then that was pretty much it. But for everybody else, it seemed like a pretty fun fight, and that's great. I'm happy for them. The second fight was a lot more interesting from a tank perspective. It is a 2-phase fight. It starts out with the first phase having 2 mobs that you want to tank very far apart from each other. It's a shadow mob and a fire mob. Again, going into that shadow and fire theme of the whole raid. So you want to keep these 2 elementals at least 50 yards apart from each other, ideally more like 70, like far opposite corners of the room from each other. Each of them does a collection of mechanics, a meteor on the ground that you have to soak as a group, 3 little swirlies that you have to individually soak as, just one person in each swirly, a mechanic on people that you need to run away from everybody, a thing on the ground that everyone needs to run out of, lots of little things to either run into or run out of. Depending on whether you're dealing with the fire one or the shadow one at the time on your side of the room, you'll get a stacking shadow debuff that lowers your health or a stacking fire debuff that does damage over time to you. The goal here is that every 30 seconds, 25 to 30 seconds or so, you want to swap the 2 mobs and keep everybody in the same location, so the tanks will go over, taunt the other guy, and then go back. This will allow you to get one set of debuffs to fall off, and then the other one to, stack back up, and you do that back and forth until one of the 2 mobs hits 50%. Then they'll both go essentially immune to damage, 99% damage reduction, and then converge and turn into a super shadow fire elemental who has a totally different moveset, and all of his abilities do a combination of reducing your health and damage over time to you that doesn't fall off over time. So the second phase of the fight becomes a huge race to the finish line. Demonstrating how, cool and creative I think that this raid is, the second phase of the fight combines the abilities that each of the 2 mobs had in the first phase in really interesting ways. For example, the second phase has a meteor on the ground that everyone needs to soak, and then once you've soaked the meteor as a group, it spawns a circle on the ground that everyone needs to run out of. Combining those 2 mechanics from the first phase from the 2 separate elementals. Pretty cool. There also is a mechanic where there are little swirlies on the ground that individual people need to soak so that they don't blow up the raid, and then once those have been soaked, they spawn things that fan out that you need to dodge. Again, combining a couple of mechanics from the first phase in a cool and interesting way. Where I think this fight gets a lot more interesting for the tanks than the first fight is the way that the tank mechanic works in the second phase of this fight. This elemental will essentially do a 2-hit combo on tanks. It does 1 hit that's physical damage, but then makes you vulnerable to magic damage, tripling your damage taken from magic, and then immediately follows that up with a giant magic damage cone. This also occurs at a time where you're needing to move the boss out of a big swirly on the ground. Especially as you progress later into the phase, it tends to overlap every single time. And it is a frontal cone where you're doing that tank swap, so you want to be very conscious of where the 2 tanks are standing, making sure that you're not fanning the raid with a massive cone of spell damage, but also making sure that you are doing that tank swap correctly, because, triple damage on a pretty big tank hit is a recipe for getting killed. So again, I think this is a lot more interesting tank fight than the first one, and a pretty good sign just in general in terms of how interesting I think this raid is going to wind up being to tank. It's very exciting. Getting to do these 2 fights on the Monk was also pretty fun. I think that Monk is going to be exceptional this tier, especially just based off of what we've seen thus far from getting to play with the tier set bonuses. Alright, so that's it for the first 2 raid bosses in terms of previewing this raid. Pretty good start, I have to say, and I'm definitely looking forward to whatever comes next. Patch 10.0.7 is landing next weekly reset, and we did put together a preview video on that, so if you want some more details and you haven't seen that already, check it out. Alright, thanks for watching. Bye.